Hi, everyone. Welcome to Melissa and Lori Love Literacy. Today, we are talking to a mom about dyslexia.
So we're here today with Jacqueline Davis, who, like you said, Lori, is a mom. And we're going to hear all about her experience learning about and advocating for her child with dyslexia and how it inspired her to take action.
Yeah. Welcome,
So,
Jacqueline, to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful for what the two of you do to help so many of us across the country really understand the brain science behind reading. So thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, we can't wait to hear from you because we're excited for your story. I think stories make this so personal and so real for, not only our audience, but especially our teachers who are looking in classrooms amongst 20, 30 kids or more. So I think if we could just jump right in, you are a mom of a dyslexic son, and we think it's really important to name that you're a mom. Like first and foremost, you didn't have an educator background. And there's a lot of misconception about dyslexia and what it is exactly. So can you share about like why do you think children struggle and feel free to make any connecting lines to your son's story as well.
I think children struggle in many ways because they're not diagnosed. And so if we know more information about children, we can intervene earlier and we can support them to succeed. We also have children, 20% of our children in this country are dyslexic. And in many schools across the country, over 60% of our schools still, we teach reading in ways that have now been discredited. And so we don't do the basic things that children need, like teach them phonemic awareness, which is sound patterns. So they're not learning the things they need to learn that we know helps them learn to read effectively, and the science tells us. So I think that's why so many children struggle. So many are undiagnosed, and even those that don't have real reading struggles or any challenges are not being taught effectively in so many of our schools that it's why we have the kind of horrible national data that we have on literacy.
yeah, absolutely. So we want to hear the story of you and your son. So take us back to the beginning and tell us the journey. Where did it start for you all? How did you know something was going on? Take us to the beginning, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so in kindergarten, I started thinking something was a little bit off. And so I went to our son's kindergarten teacher and I said, I'm a little concerned. He's not learning his alphabet. He doesn't seem to remember the order of the letters. He doesn't seem to know his colors. And when I try to rhyme with him in books, he doesn't really pick up the rhyming. Now, at that point, I did not know that those are all pretty clear indicators that there may be dyslexia or there may be a language-based challenge. But I didn't know that. I just knew I had a child who was in
They were just
kindergarten
flags.
and he didn't seem to be making progress similar to other kids I knew that were that same age. And so I went and I talked to the teacher and I said, this is a bit concerning. And she said, oh, no, no, he's a late bloomer. He's a boy. Don't worry, it will be fine. And so I trusted that because she's the teacher and I was not. And fast forward a couple of months, and I went back to school when things continued to be challenging. And I kept doing those little things. Like I put the magnet letters on the refrigerator, and I put the magnets on the, wall, and I did the bathtub on the wall, the different alphabet letters. And again, it didn't really seem to matter how much we practiced. The recall wasn't there. And so I went again and I said, what's going on? And again, it's all fine. So I let it be. And then first grade happened. And the same thing in first grade. He wasn't making progress. And yet, in so many other ways, I could tell that he was a really bright kid. He was curious. He had recall on all kinds of other information. He made connections between information. And I thought, it seems like he's a bright kid. It seems like overall he's pretty sharp. So why is he struggling so much? And so I went to the first grade teacher and I asked the same questions. And again, I was told what so many parents were told in this country, he's okay. It'll be fine. He's a boy. and he's a late bloomer. And by the winter break of first grade, I asked to meet with the special ed coordinator and the principal and his teacher. And I said, I'm really worried. He doesn't even know the full alphabet. Should we test him? And the head of special ed said, no, you can't test a kid legitimately until third grade, which I now know is incorrect. It's blatantly wrong, but I didn't know at the time. And so it
Oh
was
my
really
gosh.
COVID. It was really COVID that changed things, initially in even a worse way, but eventually it was our path out. So COVID happened, and just like every child in America, our first grader came home in that final couple of months, final quarter of first grade. And when I started sitting next to him, because he hated online learning and he really couldn't do it, he'd walk up to my computer and he'd close it. So we would have no learning. And so I started sitting next to him, trying to support him. And a couple things happened. One, I realized how incredibly far behind he was from his peers in these reading lessons. And then I started to watch how they were teaching reading. And it just didn't make sense to me. I thought, why are you telling him to look at a picture and guess what the word is? Why aren't you teaching him how to sound the word out? Why aren't you teaching him what the letters are? And that got me curious, why are we doing it this way? And the more I started to learn and research on my own, and the more I realized how far behind he was, is what then was the pivot to open up the door to us being able to support him. And that's its own story. But that was the moment, those moments around COVID where he was sitting at home and I was sitting next to him. And I had those two realizations. Wow, he is really far behind where his peers are, because I'm watching where his peers are and I'm watching his reading. And why are they teaching him to read in this way that doesn't seem to make any sense?
Yeah, Jacqueline, would you want to share if, and I don't know if you know the answer to this. This actually was a question that we didn't talk about, but when did he know? Like, when did he know? Or maybe he didn't? Was he aware ever?
He was very, very aware. It's a great question, that he was behind and that he was struggling. By the end of first grade, he was so resistant to reading that when I would try to get him to get on the Zoom call or try to get him to work on the book that the teacher had asked him to read, he would literally roll himself up like a burrito in a cream blanket that we had on the sofa and go under the kitchen table and lie there, hoping that I couldn't find him. Of course, I knew where he was. Or he would go and get inside the laundry basket and cover it so that he would be inside hiding. So it was brutal. It was painful for me to watch. It was painful to see him, and he knew. And there was one night that I'll never forget. I left the room quickly because I started to cry and I didn't want him to see me cry. I'm going to cry now. And I was tucking him into bed. He was toward the end of his first grade, and he said, Mommy, I know you want me to go to college, but I just want you to know that I won't be able to because I'm really stupid. And I said, you're not stupid. You're really smart. And he said, but Mommy, I can't read. And if you can't read, you can't go to college. So I just don't want you to hope for something that won't happen. And it was, a dagger through my heart and any mom's heart. And I tucked him in and I left the room and I just started streaming with tears. And I knew I had to do something. And his self-esteem was wrecked. He didn't believe in himself. He ended up getting temporarily diagnosed with depression the following year, which now he's a happy, confident, amazing, joyous fifth grader. But it was a journey, and that was not who he was in first grade. And he was lacking so much confidence and feeling so stupid and feeling so much shame. And that unfortunately made me so anxious and me so worried. And it was just a difficult dynamic all around, because as a mom, you love your child and you want to help them. And I didn't know how to help him. I didn't know what to do. And it was the pandemic. And so resources that might have been available were not available. And it was a very difficult period.
Jacqueline, I'm wondering if you have any insight to this. You might not, and you can just say, I have no idea. But when you talked about waiting until third grade to be diagnosed or to get that support, that just seems crazy in my mind. Like, why would we wait that long? If we know already, you knew that he was behind, why would we wait that long? Do you have any insight to why that was the case, why they said third grade?
I do actually. So I think for many years, we in this country actually believed and had, some reason to believe that you tested children at third grade and not before because you would get the most accurate assessment. The tools were designed for older children. The cognitive development was still happening. And so there were many years that we, for very solid reasons, thought third grade was about the right spot. The challenge is that we now know differently. And with that new knowledge, with so much that we now know about the brain and how the brain learns to read and the development of the brain, we now know you can very effectively test in kindergarten. What's happened and what's really unfortunate is that a lot of our educators don't yet have that information and they haven't had opportunities to learn and catch up with what the new information is. And that in fact, not only can you, but you should test in kindergarten. I believe we should test all children. I believe in universal screening at kindergarten. It's a very fast process and it gives us indication if any child is at risk so that we can intervene early and help them faster. The earlier we intervene, the more effective it is and the more cost effective it is. And so that's something I try to really help policymakers understand. It's not just about what's best for the kid, it's what's best for our pocketbooks, because the longer you wait, the more costly it is to intervene. And of course, the worse it is for a child, right? It takes longer to help them. Their self-esteem is wrecked, like my own child. They feel awful about themselves. They feel shame. And you have a family often that is also really struggling because you love your child and you're trying to support your child and you don't know what to do. And that's a horrible feeling of helplessness for a parent, to love your child and want what's best for them and to have no idea what to do.
Yeah, and the cost on the entire family system.
Yeah.
That's right.
I was just going to say too, oh, sorry, go ahead, Jacqueline.
I was going to say, ultimately, in our case, we paid for our son to be diagnosed, and it's such a privilege to be able to make that choice, and most families can't. It wasn't an easy choice for us. We had to think hard about the incredible amount of money it cost to get a full neuropsych and a diagnosis for a child. But by the end of first grade, I knew something was off and nobody in the education system was backing me up. And no one would believe me when I would push and say, he needs to be assessed. We need to do more. And I couldn't get the assessment. And so ultimately, I felt like you have to do something if you can. And we were incredibly fortunate and we were able to get him tested. It was hard in COVID because we couldn't find people to do it. It took months to find someone. But most families cannot afford to pay thousands of dollars to get a test to confirm that your child has a learning difference. And so we need our schools to listen to families and to also be really observant of what's happening with children and test. And again, that's why I believe in universal screening for all kindergartners, because we should know. We should know who's at risk. We should know what indicators are in place. We should know who seems like they're absolutely on track and who is not, so that we can do something about it.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you earlier about was I can imagine some people listening might hear kindergarten and think, well, they're not supposed to be reading in kindergarten yet. So how can you test them to see, but you're talking about some of those things like the letter recognition that you saw in your son. And
exactly.
Are there other things like that?
There are. So, now that I've learned so much more, there are a set of things. Again, they're not 100% correlative, but they're indicators, right? And so if your children struggle with colors, our child Madden struggled a lot with his colors. He could not remember what the colors were. And I just lost this. He could not remember what the colors were. We would show him blue again and again, and he would go and say orange. And I would say, no, it's blue. So colors are an indicator. Again, not 100%, but they're an indicator to dig a little more. Rhyming patterns. Children that can rhyme usually are in better shape than children who can't. It's indicator again that there may be something going on. And then also the sound letter correspondence and just remembering the alphabet, just knowing, A is A and B is B, and also the sequence in which the letters come in. So those are a couple of the early indicators. There's also some indicators just in like their hand coordination and things like that in terms of their writing to raise questions around dysgraphia. Again, you don't expect a child in kindergarten to be a perfect scribe yet, but you can start to see some early signs.
I'm so glad that you named these in particular, Jacqueline, because I had just written that down for myself to ask you about, because the thing that keeps coming to my mind is, yes, universal screeners, but yes, valid ones. And, I think that that's really important because I live in a district where we use invalid measures, and, we use Fontes and Pinnell, and that is part of a child's assessment for dyslexia, which we know is not even close to a research-based way that we should be doing the assessments. And also, if we're using like a units of study where students are being asked to look at the picture, then that's also not like those assessments embedded within that curriculum framework are probably also not valid. So I just want to make sure like that we kind of stamp that like the measures that you just shared are very valid universal screeners. They're valid measures. So, parents listening, I imagine a parent is thinking, well, if my child got assessed, then it seems valid. They did an assessment. Definitely dig in, like parents, teachers, like dig into what the actual assessments are and think about how research aligns or doesn't to those.
Yeah, it's really hard as a parent to know what the science says, right? And not all
So
of us are
hard.
going to spend the time diving in and reading. As my son says, someone said to me, "How do you know so much?" And my son said, "She has 10 feet of books sitting on her desk about reading, and she's read them all." But there are some sources that can make it easier for parents. So you can go to the International Dyslexia Association website, and they will list valid screeners that they confirm are effective for children. You can go to Nadine Gabb, the Gabb Lab, her list of screeners that are validated. Amira Learning has a free one. There are several out there, and you can do a bit of Googling and just make sure that they are validated screeners. I also tell parents, ask your school what they are using to teach your child reading. Ask what the curriculum is. And if they say Lucy Calkins, units of study, balanced literacy, Fontes and Pinnell, that should raise a big flag because those are all programs and curriculums that we know are not aligned to the science of how children learn to read. So we know that. And then I say, go look on Student Achievement Partners, go look on Ed Reports, and you can literally pull up the scores, the letter scores and grades for different curriculums. And you'll see that those have received an F. Print the report and take it to your principal and ask your principal, why are you still using a curriculum that all of these national organizations have given an F? And so I tell people those websites all the time. I send the links out and I say, take it to your school and tell them you are using a curriculum that we know is not aligned to what we know about brain science. Why? And just ask them why. And start to push and start to demand that your child deserves something different. It's a long process, unfortunately, for some schools to change over and for districts to change over. So then parents say, well, what do I do in the interim? And I think that's the hard question is what do you do in the interim, particularly if you're in a school or a school system where they are continuing to use curriculum that we know doesn't work. And over 60% of our American schools are still using curriculum that we know doesn't work. It isn't aligned to the science. So what do you do? What do that 60% of parents do? And it is hard. And I don't honestly know if I have the right set of answers, but I tell parents, you can get a pretty simple book on phonics. Start working with your child with phonics, teach your child the names and the sounds of the alphabet. and then help them if they're younger, 3, 4, help them match those letters and those sounds to objects in your house. Read to them a lot. And then don't just read, but stop and ask questions and point out words and help them sound out words. Like there are things you can do, but not much really replaces an explicit, structured literacy program in a school that is the right curriculum, the right instructional materials, and a teacher knowing how to teach effectively how children read. So it's extremely hard to replace what's happening in a school.
Yeah, it's such a good point. It is very hard. And that's why I think we, are such champions for teachers getting the professional learning and the materials, the great materials that they need to be able to do their jobs. And I also want to just kind of piggyback and then kind of keep going with where you're going. But I want to piggyback to say, like, it is the things that you were saying, the misalignment piece, they're misaligned in more ways than one. Yes, you spoke about that explicit instruction, that systematic scope and sequence. You're right. There's not a replacement for that. I think it's incredibly difficult to do at home, right? But the best case scenario is that children are going to school and receiving that explicit, structured, systematic instruction. If not, I think we're going to go there. You're going to give us some ideas. So I'm excited to take us down that path. But I also want to say there are ways that the programs that we mentioned as examples, as well as things that are misaligned to research, are disconnected. And for example, like it kind of, I feel like it's pervasive in more ways than just the idea of phonics, right? So reading that is disconnected to what you're writing about. Okay, there's like your whole literacy block. So that is a big misalignment to research that I think often we don't talk about as much because, and especially for the sake of this conversation, right? We're talking about just literally instruction in how to read, right? Like pulling the words off the page. But I do want to make sure that we kind of take a moment and say that because I think it's important to note that there is a bigger disconnect than just what's happening in that phonics space and the structured, systematic instruction in that phonics scope and sequence. There, and I'm just giving a real concrete example, right? Like, and that's why, like, if your child is writing creatively and
it's a problem
disconnected to what they're reading, or it's a problem. Or like, for example, they're spending the majority of their day in small groups reading a different book than their other peer groups, and the teacher is working that's not like actual instruction I think that we've evolved into with the science. So